We are picking up in Mark, the 8th chapter, and we're going to look at just verses 27 through 30. By way of recap, before we begin to read those verses, just a quick reminder, we are just coming off of where Jesus has healed the blind man and has told him not to go in and tell anyone in the town what it is that he has done for him. And so we finished off last week with that particular command not to spread any information. And I bring that up because we're going to see a very similar statement made in our text this evening as well. Picking up at chapter 8 and verse 27, we read, "Now Jesus and his disciples went out of the town of Caesarea Philippi, near on the road." Excuse me, I'm going to start again. "Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying, 'Who do men say that I am?' And they answered, 'John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Peter answered and said to him, 'You are the Christ.' Then he charged them that they should tell no one about him." And so picking up at verse 27, we see that he and his disciples, actually it should say, go out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And so we're seeing here that he has left the area that he was in. And I apologize for the wording on the slide there. But as we see in the verse, it says that he went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And so he is on the road, and while they are traveling after leaving this healing, he asks them a very simple and very direct question. He asks them, "Who do men say that I am?" And then in verse 28, they give an answer. And their answer is, some say that you are John the Baptist, risen from the dead. Others say Elijah, or maybe one of the prophets. And these are responses that the disciples have heard people have said as to who they claim Jesus might be. And so we have these various ideas that people have. And it's an interesting question as he asks this. It's kind of a broad question. He wants to know, Jesus is asking the question or starting the conversation with, who is it that men say that I am? And after he gets his answer, in verse 29, we see that he brings it to a second and more personal question. He started out with, who do men say? And then he gets down to the individual. And he says, but who do you say that I am? You see, it really doesn't matter what everybody else is saying. Jesus' concern for each person individually, both with his disciples then and with us today, is, who do you say that I am? Despite what the world may say, despite what you may have heard, what is it that you say? And it's interesting to note that behind this idea is the idea of believing who he is. But it goes beyond just believing, because it would be one thing to believe something. It's another thing to believe something and to share it. And it's important to recognize that one of the responsibilities, and we can kind of teach this if we're dealing with someone who is new to understanding the scriptures, is that there becomes a responsibility to actually express and to talk about and to share what that belief may be. And then we see the answer come from Peter, who responds, "You are the Christ." And the meaning of this term is the Messiah, or the Anointed One. And so we only see response from Peter himself. We don't hear of a response or hear the response of the others, but we have an answer from Peter. He has said with all confidence, "This is who you are." And this is who Peter is bold enough and confident enough to say he doesn't have any doubt in his mind. It doesn't matter what other people say. It doesn't concern him that his answer is different than what everybody else has to say. It is simply a fact that he believes, and he states that Jesus is the Christ, or the meaning of the Messiah, or the Anointed One. He is the one that has been prophesied to come, is basically what Peter's response is. And we're going to finish up very quickly. Again, this was a very brief section of Scripture and a very brief segment. But we're going to finish up with what Jesus does in verse 30. He gives them a warning, and he tells them, or charges them. Some phrases use charge, some say he warns them, tell no one about him. The message of Christ cannot be understood without the cross. It's interesting, he doesn't make that statement. That's a description, the second point. But the idea here is that he doesn't want them to share exactly what Peter has just said. And we know that this is not the first time, and that's why I made reference back to our previous study, that this is not the first time that he tells someone not to mention who he is or what he's done. And while we may not understand it, and we may have questions in our mind, and it may seem confusing, and again, this is something that we can express to someone that's new and trying to understand, and doesn't this seem kind of contradictory to what you would think he would want? But the statement is, and what we need to concern ourselves with, is exactly what Christ says, and that is to tell no one about him. Now, the reason being is the next point, is that the message of Christ cannot be understood without the cross. The fact is, at this particular time, if they were to claim Jesus as the Messiah, it would only add to the confusion of the Jews, because they were seeking a king to overthrow the Romans. And so, if they have heard that this is the Messiah, then they would try to move toward forcing him to take the role of a king, the earthly king that they perceive he is to be, because they don't understand the message of the Messiah. And that is because, as was stated in the previous points that we looked at, you can't understand it without the cross. And at this point, there would be nothing to gain. It wasn't the right time. Everything that God and Jesus do, and this is something we can't explain, everything that God and Jesus do, they do on their terms, when they decide that the time is right. And just to give you a little bit of a potential context, it's not in 27 through 30, but there's additional explanation, I believe, that we find as to why he gives this charge or this warning. So I will read for you verse 31, and then I will encourage you to study beginning at verse 31 as we begin to pick up next week. But in verse 31 we see that he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So one of the reasons and that he gives is, that shows it's not the right time, is because there are things that must happen. And until those things happen, the Jews and the people might not understand what it means for him to be the Christ, and what he is to do, what it means for him to be the Anointed One. He has things that he must endure, and there are things that must take place that it may have been more difficult for those things to come about if there was confusion. We must allow for God to work and Jesus to work on their time, in their way, and we must accept the fact that we may not always understand why they do what they do. That will be the conclusion for this very short section that we have looked at. Again, the goal of this is not to say that you need to go and you need to teach these ideas or create your own class for teaching a new convert, which is really the goal for this particular study. You don't have to just use one section. You can choose to do multiple sections. You can choose to do just one. A lot is going to depend on the person that you're working with, the amount of time that needs to go in, and it can be different for different people. But the truth is, you don't have to spend 45 minutes to an hour with someone and sometimes overwhelm them in order to help them just take a look at a few key passages of Scripture and gain some understanding that God desires for us to understand. We will close at this point and begin picking up with verse 31 in our next section. Thank you.